Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Richa, and I happen to be part of patents, but somehow I don't particularly like technology. It changes too fast for my taste. I'm a little backward. You know, I was born in the era when you could actually change those. You had those audio tapes, which you had to use the pencil to wind them up. And I thought I'm going to ignore technology after CDs, but then they got Blu-ray. I still can't ignore technology. Then I became a patent lawyer, and I thought after generics, I'm definitely going to ignore technology. But now they've got biosimilars, and it just refuses to go away. You just cannot ignore technology. It keeps on changing, it keeps on giving you new challenges. And especially in the 21st century, if you look at it, the surprising part is that this century has given us a bumper crop of worriers. Honestly, I'm very good at worrying. I think most of us are. We worry about strange things. I worry about scientists one day discovering that lettuce has been fattening all along. That's one of my primary worries. I worry sometimes that one of my sons will marry an Eskimo and my daughter-in-law will set me adrift on a snowflake when I can't feed myself. So I have these worries. But more than that, so most of us have these idiosyncrasies, we have our own worries. But why do we worry so much? By far, we are the healthiest, wealthiest, and longest lived individuals in history. Let's not get into that mongering where you say that, oh, Holocaust is arriving. It is not. But the fact of the matter is that we are worriers. We worry. The reason why we worry so much is possibly because we have so much to lose. In the 1900s, a child which was born would possibly have an average age of about 46 years. 1980, that person's grandchild would possibly have somewhere about 60, 67 years. In today's date and age, if you're lucky to be born in one of the Western countries, you'll possibly push something beyond 80. So I think that's one of the reasons why we are so worried. There's so much to lose. So we worry. We worry about the environment. We worry about the avian flu. We worry about breast cancer. We worry about the biggest, the better knower, terrorism. We worry about terrorism all the time. 9/11 happened in the US, and suddenly there was a hue and cry about how, the world is going to come to an end. The number of people who died in 9/11, I think as per the official records, were 2,997. That was inclusive of the 19 terrorists who died. So that's, say, about 3,000 people. So why do biosimilars become important? What am I talking about? They become important because 3,000 people died in a terrorist attack, but 36,000 people die of flu-related diseases in America alone. 100,000 people die because of obesity. 300,000 people die because of diabetes. And God knows how many people die in countries where we do not have such data. That is why biosimilars are important, because they provide treatment without a lot of side effects. So let's move on to biosimilars. So what are biosimilars? These are follow-on versions of recombinant DNA proteins. Now, why are they so complex? Because obviously they're proteins. They are susceptible to temperatures, to catalysts, to a lot of other things which can actually alter their character to quite a degree. So these are blockbuster drugs, most of them whose, the patent has expired, and you can have another drug which replaces that. So these are the copies of the expensive originals, and we all know that how, being a socialist country, we can understand how difficult it is when you're talking about an original drug. So the global biosimilars market, if you look at it, it's expected to reach from 6.22 billion. It's from 2.29 billion to, by 2020, it will reach 6.22 billion, which is quite a lot of money we are looking at. Now, I'd just like to show you this world map. So if you look at this, you'll see that India is one of the potential markets for biosimilars. Also because we have a lot of generics, but there is a problem. We don't count generics and biosimilars as the same. They are different. And why are they different? We will come to that eventually. But before that, these are the definitions which have been given by EMA, WHO, in Korea, in Canada, in India, and the USA, where the FDA has given a particular definition. So please take your time. I have only 15 minutes. I'll not go through them. You can read it at your own leisure. So these are just the definitions which define biosimilars. Moving on, what is the difference between generics and biosimilars? So when you're talking about generics, you're talking about the quality, you're talking about the purity, you're talking about the stability, which again, you're talking about the same thing in biosimilars, but then you have additional criteria. You're talking about not only the stability, you're also talking about the immunogenicity, comparability, and interchangeability. Like I said, they are proteins. They are highly susceptible to a lot of changes. So if you can look at those two pictures that I've provided, this is how it is. They also, surprisingly, actually there's no surprise there, they will obviously take a lot more time to develop, because it's not a case of just reverse engineering. It is different. It takes time. It takes a lot more monetary investment if you're trying to make biosimilars. Moving on, if you look at the regulatory landscape, this is the evolution of it. So starting from Canada and US, WHO also, they all brought it about in 2010. Mexico, of course, actually it was Canada and US who actually started it. EU, of course, is 2005. Then moving on, you can see India is 2012. That's the time when we first got a regulatory thing. China 2015, Japan 2009, New Zealand in 2011, and Australia in 2006. So this is how world over biosimilars, there is a global regulatory landscape. You can make it like that. Okay, let's move on to what else is there. The approval requirements, and I'll just do a quick comparison of WHO, US, EU, and wherever we have India, because the Indian government wanted that, they did not want that the domestic industry should always be at loggerheads with somebody else. We wanted that some place where we can coexist peacefully, because this is something which has to be done. So there are certain regulations which have been given by the Indian government, so we'll just quickly go through it. So these are the terms used. Then if you come to the primary biosimilar guidelines, then these are the guidelines which have been taken care of. Then the scope, most of them have recombinant protein drugs. Sometimes you can use the language as mainly, otherwise most of the time it is recombinant proteins that we are talking about. Okay, when we are talking about what happens in biosimilar is that you have to have a reference product. That is what you're copying. So the reference product, in case of WHO, it should be authorized in the country or region in question. In USA, it must be licensed under a full biologics license application. In EU, it must be on a complete dossier. The reference of biologics should be licensed or approved in India or the ICH countries. That is what the position is right now. Now, when we come to quality, then head-to-head comparison is required in WHO. In US, you need analytical studies. Again, when you look at the analytical studies, India also provides for similar analytical studies, but there are a lot of other considerations which also we have included. Then EU, again, quality aspects of comparability must be considered in relation to implications for safety and efficacy. And in India, again, we have, like I said, analytical methods should be applied to detect even the slightest difference in all relevant quality attributes. So this is what has been done. Labeling, in WHO, while they say that it has to be as similar to reference as is possible, however, US, EU, and India do not address labeling at all. Moving on to clinical trials. Clinical trials in WHO, they are required. In India also they are required, so are they required in US and EU. And in India, when you're talking about the clinical trials, it's a Schedule Y, and Schedule Y takes care of rodents and non-rodents. Talking of rodents, I can see everybody's getting bored. Have you ever seen rodents? Rats? I think they're some kind of super species. Don't you think so? I mean, you can just envy their decadence. They have been plied with everything under the sun. and yet they survive. There are certain questions that humankind really needs to stop and ask themselves. Question number 1. I'll ask you 5. 1. How are there more rats than men? Have you ever seen a dull, listless, iron-starved rat ever? Have you met a rat whom you can yell at and he couldn't hear you? Have you met a rat who couldn't outrun you? Somewhere, every time you turn around, something has been taken away by the technology which has been tested on these rats, who have survived it all, mind you. No rat has ever dropped dead with red lipstick on its teeth, ever. They have been plied with booze, pot, saccharine, red dye number 2, too much sun, caffeine, you name it. There was a rat like that once, and they had subjected him to everything, and his name was Lionel. And they decided that this is kind of a super rat, and it's a miracle rat, and it's going to survive everything under the sun. Because it did survive everything, okay? So the gentleman who was carrying out all these tests on him, he finally one day decided that, okay, this super rat, I'm going to take him home for a pet for my children. The rat couldn't survive 3 weeks. It's dead. Okay. Moving on to non-clinical data, it should include, in case of WHO, both pharmacodynamic as well as pharmacokinetic properties. They have to be compared. In US, it has to be taken from animal studies, like I said, and in EU, if you see, it's designed to detect differences in response between the biosimilar and the reference product, both in vitro and in vivo. In India as well, we have followed this model. So in India also, in vitro and in vivo studies have to be included. Moving on, extrapolation of indications. It may be possible, in case of WHO, they have been very clear that if a sensitive clinical test model has been used, that is able to detect potential differences between the products. In US, surprisingly, it has not been addressed. But if you look at EU, then it is possible in certain cases of recombinant proteins. In India also, justification for extrapolation of indication shall be based on comparability in quality, preclinical and clinical studies both. Naming, like I said, again, like labeling, this has also not been very clear in India. So in US, EU and India, again, it has not been addressed. However, WHO has made it clear that it should be identifiable by a unique proprietary name. Data protection has not been addressed by WHO. They don't need to do that. US and EU have been clear about that. They want data protection for this. But India, again, we have not addressed it. So moving on, I think this is basically what we have on regulations as far as the 4 different parameters are concerned. But this is just a brief outline that I have on Indian market scenario. So these are just figures which make sense, because since 2008, the Indian biosimilar industry has grown, and this is the compounded annual growth rate, and it's 30%, so that's pretty impressive if you look at it. 25 Indian companies operating in biosimilar space, marketing close to 50 products in the Indian market. And if you look at the figures, then it looks very hopeful. So it is supposed to cross the 40 billion mark by 2030. So that's about 100 billion extra. And major players are Dr. Reddy's, Zydus Cadila, Wockhardt, etc. That's the reason why they are making it into the Fortune 500 companies. So these are some of the approved products that we have. Again, please feel free to go through them at your leisure. I'm not going to waste time on that. Moving on, these are the various guidelines which have been taken on in India as far as biosimilars and the regulations are concerned. Yet again, please feel free to go through them whenever you feel like it, but these are just basic guidelines wherever, we have found that, okay, there's no clarity, we have gone through these particular guidelines. Okay, these are the factors taken into consideration for selection of reference biologic. Now, these are important. So the first is that the active ingredient and strength of the reference product must be the same. Then the same reference product must be used throughout the study of quality, safety, and efficacy. So it's the same reference product you're using. It should be approved and marketed in India. And if not authorized in India, then it must be licensed and marketed for a period of 4 years. So post-approval in innovator's jurisdiction is required in this particular case. If you look at the approval pathway, this is the approval pathway. So first of all, you need the approval from Institutional Biosafety Committee, followed by the DBT. Then you have the Schedule Y approval, the same rodent, non-rodent variety. Go on to the GLP accredited laboratory. Then, of course, the DCGI, the Director General. And then you move on to DSMB. I'll go on to that. For marketing and manufacturing license, you have a report to be submitted to DCGI. The dossier needs to be approved. The batch needs, first 3 batches need to be tested at the National Institute of Biologics. Post-approval committee, you have the post-marketing surveillance, which is like I told you in the previous slide, it's for a period of 4 years. And every 6 months, safety reportings have to be done to the DCGI. These are the approval authorities. So there is the Institutional Biosafety Committee, the Review Committee for Genetic Manipulation, the Central Drug Research, Central Drug Standard Control Organization, and the Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee. So they are basically looking into this. Moving on, this is the protocol that we are following. So, do I have a minute? 1 minute, okay. So if you can go through these are the 5 protocols that we are looking at. So how does one go from the indigenous product development to LMO? That is exactly what you are looking at, especially where the end product is an LMO and where the end product is not an LMO. These are the current issues, which we all know about. I'm sure some of my other colleagues will be talking about it. I think especially Archana ma'am would be talking about this, where we have had some litigation with regard to biosimilars. And there are, of course, issues pertaining to compulsory licensing, but then we always expected that. And I think the only issue that has not been brought forward, which should be brought forward, is that most of the medical practitioners are very unaware of biosimilars. They need to be educated more, they need to know more about it, and their awareness has to be increased. I think barring that, this is the way forward in the Indian biosimilar industry. So it's definitely a hot investment spot. The physicians obviously have to be retrained. There has to be some kind of partnership, hopefully a workable partnership with the international market. You have to sensitize the practitioners, very important, and export to regulated and semi-regulated countries is important. Patent litigation, that is always very important. And we have to establish a clear data exclusivity regime. So I think that sums up my 1 minute. Thank you very much.